You made a decision today that you thought was rational. You weighed the options, you considered the factors, you arrived at a conclusion that felt logical and deliberate and entirely your own. And you are almost certainly wrong about how that decision was actually made. Not wrong about the decision itself necessarily, but wrong about the process that produced it, because the story most people tell themselves about how they decide things, the story of the careful rational agent evaluating options and selecting the best one, has been systematically dismantled by decades of research in behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience. And what that research has revealed in its place is both humbling and extraordinarily useful. Your decisions are being shaped by forces you are not aware of, processed through systems you did not consciously engage, and influenced by factors that have nothing to do with the quality of the options in front of you. And until you understand how your decision-making actually works, you will keep believing you are steering when you are often just a passenger in a vehicle driven by something much older and much less rational than the thinking mind you identify with. Today, we are going to go inside the hidden psychology of decision-making, and what you find there is going to change how you think about every significant choice you have ahead of you. Let us begin with the most foundational framework in the psychology of decision-making, because everything else builds on it. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on human judgment and decision-making, describes the mind as operating through two distinct systems that he calls System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive, and largely unconscious. It runs continuously in the background, processing enormous amounts of information and generating impressions, feelings, and impulses with extraordinary speed and almost no effort. It is the system that reads the emotion on a face before you consciously register what you are seeing. That pulls your hand away from a hot surface before your conscious mind has processed the heat. That generates the feeling in your gut about a person or a situation that arrives before any logical analysis. System 2 is slow, deliberate, effortful, and conscious. It is the system you engage when you solve a math problem, plan a complex project, or carefully evaluate the terms of a contract. It requires concentration and it depletes energy rapidly. And here is the critical insight that changes everything about how you understand your own choices. System 2 is not the primary driver of your decisions. System 1 is. In the vast majority of situations, System 1 generates a conclusion, and System 2 is recruited not to evaluate the conclusion independently, but to rationalize it, to construct a logical story about why the fast intuitive verdict was the right one. We think we are reasoning our way to decisions. We are mostly finding reasons for decisions that were already made below the level of conscious awareness. Now let us talk about decision fatigue, because this is one of the most practically consequential findings in the entire psychology of choice, and most people are experiencing its effects every single day without having any idea it is happening. Roy Baumeister, whose research on what he called ego depletion, demonstrated that the capacity for effortful mental processing, including deliberate decision-making, is a finite resource that depletes with use. Every decision you make throughout the day draws from the same cognitive reservoir. And as that reservoir empties, the quality of your decisions deteriorates in very specific and very predictable ways. You either default to increasingly impulsive choices because System 1 takes over as System 2 fatigues, or you default to the status quo, choosing whatever requires the least additional decision-making energy, not because the status quo is optimal, but because evaluation itself has become cognitively expensive. A landmark study of Israeli judges found that prisoners who appeared before the parole board early in the morning received parole approximately 65% of the time. Prisoners who appeared late in the day before a lunch break received parole less than 10% of the time. The same cases, the same legal criteria, dramatically different outcomes based entirely on where in the decision sequence the judge was operating. The judges were not being deliberately unjust. They were being human. Their decision-making capacity was depleting across the day and defaulting to the safest, most effortless option, which in a parole context is denial. Your decisions are doing the same thing every day after a certain point in the afternoon, and you almost certainly do not know it. Here is where the psychology of decision-making gets both more complex and more fascinating. Because beyond the depletion of deliberate thinking, there are systematic distortions built into the architecture of human judgment that operate not as occasional errors, but as consistent and predictable biases. Kahneman and Tversky identified dozens of these biases, and their research demonstrated that they are not random. They follow patterns. They are the predictable outputs of heuristics, mental shortcuts that System 1 uses to process information quickly that work well in many situations but produce reliable errors in others. Anchoring bias means that the first number or piece of information you encounter in a decision context has a disproportionate influence on your final judgment, even when that anchor is arbitrary or irrelevant. Confirmation bias means that once you form an initial impression or preference, your information processing system actively seeks evidence that confirms it and discounts evidence that contradicts it. The availability heuristic means that you assess the probability or importance of something based on how easily examples come to mind rather than on actual statistical frequency, which is why people dramatically overestimate the risk of vivid dramatic threats and underestimate the risk of mundane statistical ones. Sunk cost fallacy means that you factor resources already spent into forward-looking decisions, even though those spent resources cannot be recovered, and should therefore be irrelevant to what you do next. Each of these biases is not an occasional lapse in otherwise sound reasoning. It is a systematic feature of the cognitive architecture that produces all of your judgments, and they are operating in every significant decision you will ever make. Let us go deeper into one of the most consequential cognitive biases because it touches virtually every important decision domain in your life. Loss aversion. Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory demonstrated through extensive experimentation that the psychological pain of losing something is approximately twice as powerful as the psychological pleasure of gaining something of equivalent value. This asymmetry has profound implications for decision-making in every domain. It means that you hold on to investments that are losing value longer than rational analysis would justify because selling would make the loss feel real and final. It means you stay in situations that are no longer serving you, relationships, jobs, living arrangements, because leaving requires giving up what you currently have, even when what you would gain is objectively better. It means you are more motivated by the framing of avoiding loss than by the equivalent framing of achieving gain, even when the outcomes are mathematically identical. Marketers and negotiators who understand this exploit it with precision. Framing something as what you will lose if you do not act is consistently more persuasive than framing the same thing as what you will gain if you do. Not because the loss framing is more accurate, but because it activates a psychological system that assigns it more weight than the gain framing can generate. Understanding loss aversion does not eliminate it, but it gives you the ability to recognize when your reluctance to act is being driven by the fear of losing what you have rather than by a genuine assessment of whether what you have is worth keeping. Here is something that challenges the assumption at the heart of most American consumer culture, and it comes directly from the psychology of choice. More options are not better for decision-making. They are worse. Barry Schwartz, in his research on what he calls the paradox of choice, demonstrated that beyond a certain threshold, increasing the number of options available to a decision-maker produces three specific and measurable negative outcomes. It increases the difficulty of making the decision to the point of paralysis. It reduces satisfaction with the choice ultimately made, because the unchosen options generate what Schwartz calls opportunity cost regret, and it increases the likelihood that the decision maker will blame themselves for any dissatisfaction with the outcome, because with so many options available, any negative result feels like evidence that they chose wrong. This is why people with fewer options in critical domains often report higher satisfaction with their decisions than people with more options, not because their outcomes are objectively better, but because the cognitive and emotional costs of high-choice environments are substantial and largely invisible to the people bearing them. The practical implication is direct. For decisions that matter, deliberately constrain your options rather than expanding them. Set criteria that eliminate most options before you begin evaluating. Pre-commit to processes that reduce the number of active choices you face, because the enemy of good decisions is not too few options, it is too many. Now let us talk about what actually produces better decisions, because understanding the biases without building the practices that compensate for them leaves you informed but not improved. The most important structural change you can make to your decision-making process is what behavioral scientists call choice architecture. Designing the conditions under which your decisions are made rather than leaving those conditions to chance. This means protecting your most important decisions for the times when your cognitive resources are at their peak. Earlier in the day, before decision fatigue has begun its predictable deterioration. It means creating physical and temporal distance from high-emotion situations before making decisions that will be shaped by whatever emotion is most activated in the moment. Research consistently shows that even small delays between emotional arousal and decision execution significantly improve the quality of the eventual choice. It means writing out the key factors in an important decision, rather than holding them in working memory, because externalizing the variables reduces the cognitive load that makes shortcuts and biases more likely. And it means developing pre-commitment strategies for your most bias-vulnerable decision domains. Deciding in advance when the conditions are calm and rational, what you will do when specific situations arise, so that the decision is not made in the heat of the moment when System 1 is running the show and System 2 is either depleted or recruited for rationalization rather than evaluation. Here is the truth that ties everything we have covered into something you can actually use. Better decision-making is not about becoming more rational in the abstract sense. Your brain will always have System 1 running. You will always have cognitive biases operating in the background. Decision fatigue will always affect the quality of your late-day choices. These are features of the human mind, not bugs that can be patched with enough willpower or self-awareness. Better decision-making is about building systems that account for what your mind actually does, rather than what you wish it did. Protect your important decisions from the time-of-day effects of decision fatigue by scheduling them intentionally. Create delays between emotional states and important choices to let System 2 catch up with what System 1 has already concluded. Name the specific biases most likely to be active in each significant decision you face, because naming them activates the prefrontal evaluation that counteracts them. Seek information that specifically challenges your initial impression rather than confirms it, because confirmation bias will do the confirming automatically, while contradictory evidence requires active pursuit. And build pre-commitment structures for the decisions you know in advance will be hardest to make well under pressure. None of this makes you a perfectly rational decision maker. Nobody is, but it makes you a self-aware one. And a self-aware decision maker who understands their own cognitive limitations and designs their environment to compensate for them will consistently outperform a confident but unaware one in every domain that matters. Not because they are smarter, because they are honest about how they actually think, and that honesty is the beginning of genuine judgment.